Yeah, I'm Lauren Wiedemer. Don't know what else you need to know about me, but I work at the college with undergraduate students and with the music students.
And I'm David Myers, retired and tired.
Yes.
And I'm Brian Logan. I work at First Baptist, and I'm also a teacher.
Awesome. I got a kick out of all of the things you just said, Lauren. I totally understand that you're always beautiful and bring so much to the conversation and chipper. And David, I'm one of those things you said. Yeah. And Brian, I am also a teacher. And so it's fun to get to be with you guys. Before we started, we had just said that it's kind of nice to see each other in this format. So for everybody who will be sharing the lesson with us, we're happy that we get to be with you and see you, because I know that all of us are kind of missing some of that normal gathering opportunity. So for today's lesson, we were talking about the last few weeks. The Bible study guide has been asking us to consider the presence of God. What is the presence of God, and how does it affect us? How do we know it? How do we respond to it? And so we've been following the story and the journey kind of the Ark of the Covenant. And, you know, a covenant being maybe like a bond or an agreement. And so this ark is kind of this symbolic and physical pact between God and the Israelites. We've been looking at, where can I meet God? What is God's presence? What is it? What is it? Where is it? And why does his presence matter? And how does God's presence address my sin? And how do I respond to it? And so lastly, today we're going to look at this idea of God's presence. We know where it is, we can find it, we can respond to it. But how do I go about worshiping God? What does that look like? Is there a right or a wrong way? And maybe what are my motives for worshiping? And what's the difference between performing worship and then actual, really intentional inner praise? So those are kind of our questions today. So I'm going to start it off by asking these experts on our screen to respond. And the question really is, what is the point of worshiping God? And with that, I want to ask you, I think we all know worship can be really private, or it can be also in a public setting. We've experienced both. But why do we do it? What compels us to worship? And who is it for? Is it for us, or is it for God? I already qualified you as experts, so you're welcome to, yes, there you go. And just, you can speak from personal experience, why do we worship, and what does it look like, and who is it for?
I think that worship is and I'm not going to use this term correctly, but it's a mixed bag, because it's lifting our praises to the heavens, but it's also for us too, to feed our souls.
Mm-hmm.
And I think worship kind of guides our paths as we walk through the week, as we work through the week, as we're around other people. When we worship, we try to become closer to God and try to feel his presence and discern his guidance. And so, for me, it's driving down the road, it's walking from the car to the house, it's, sitting in a classroom. Sometimes you think, well, I'd really like to say this, but I'm not going to, because of the situations we're in. But at the same time, it's, you can see worship, its purpose in what you're doing there. So I think it's it's that mixed bag of all of the above.
Yes. Yep.
And we worship. What draws us to worship, I think, is the fact that he's worthy of that. We acknowledge our dependence upon him. We acknowledge his majesty and glory as compared to who we are as earthly creatures. And so we're just drawn to worship the one who is superior. We worship him. Right. But I think Brian's right. It's for both of us. I think God calls us to worship him and lift our praises to him. At the same time, it's a blessing to us to draw near to him and to offer these praises to him. So right. It's both. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's super unique. That God orchestrated this thing called worship, and it's not only for us to glorify him, but we can also receive blessings from that too. And when I think of worship, I think of first I think of corporate worship, like going to church, singing songs together, but also for me personally, being out in nature and just experiencing the majesty of creation is really worshipful too. And I think that's unique as well, because it doesn't have to just be singing songs. You can find worship in everything, because God created everything, and David said, that he's worthy of all of that. So
right. And it's all of you kind of drew one conclusion, and that is that we do it because, God is great and he has provided all these things for us. And in circumstance, often Brian said just everyday circumstance, or you guys just said, in corporate intentional worship, we're drawn to do it because we acknowledge all that he's done for us. And what's interesting about worship is that we're created to respond to God. I think that's kind of maybe a really watered down summary of why we exist. But when I think about it, we don't have to worship in a way. God has already given us his grace and his forgiveness and his mercy, and he's given us Jesus Christ. And so worship is a response to our acknowledgement of that gift. And so to me, it's kind of interesting that we don't have to do it, but I think you all just said we're compelled to, because we feel, like David said, he is superior. He's this great being, or this majesty, this presence in our life that helps us also be in our own place too. We recognize our place and our smallness, maybe, in our gratefulness. And give a really little mini history lesson so people can kind of understand where our verses fit our discussion today. What we're going to look at is in 2 Samuel, there are a couple verses devoted to this moment, really the actual moment that the Ark of the Covenant is finally brought. From history, we know that Moses has the ark constructed, and then we're going to see the moment where David kind of triumphantly gets it into Jerusalem finally. So it's had this long journey, and the ark, was constructed during the time of Moses. God spoke to Moses and gave him the 10 Commandments, right? And he wrote them on the tablets of stone, and Moses brought those down to the people. And then God says, they're going to construct this ark, this really fancy, ornate box to put these commandments, this covenant between God and his people. They're going to put it in it. And what's kind of interesting is we can look at this story of the ark and look at how we as people respond to God's presence, because throughout Exodus and Leviticus, you see really, really detailed discussion of this process. The ark is built to very exact specifications, and it's ornate, and it's not really to be touched by human hands. The ark is kind of a symbolic and a physical embodiment of God's presence, and the people come to know it as the place where God resides. And then it's carried with them everywhere they go. It's this central location. And I kind of think we see starting here maybe this idea of community, a sense of unity and worship around the presence of God. We see that develop throughout this time. And then obviously a tabernacle is built. And so the people learned that having God always present in their midst, I guess, kind of creates this sense of unity. But when I think about it, how easily it would have been for the people to worship the actual ark, but they didn't. God did it in such a way that they understood that really it was just kind of a symbolic place, his presence, his essence, And so for us, sometimes the presence of God can be elusive. Where do we find him? He's not in an ark we can go look at. But the people learned, I think, as a people group, to start thinking about God as being always present in their midst. We benefit from that today. And God was super smart about how I look, as God as a teacher, and he knows us humans, and we have to have a lot of teaching, and we also have to be able to make a lot of mistakes to learn. And he used this experience. So the last thing, the little detail we need to know is that at some point the Philistines capture the ark. They get it. through wars and things, and they have it for a long time. And then Saul is the king, and finally David becomes the king, and he is going to defeat the Philistines and be able to kind of put them in their place. And so one of his objectives when this happens and David becomes king is he decides he needs to go get the ark, and he wants to bring it to the city of David. And so he does, and we see that he has a little fiasco the first try. Doesn't work out so well, but he's determined. And so we see what we're going to talk about today is the actual passage where it's finally happening. David brings it there for probably a lot of reasons. It's probably political. He's trying to also demonstrate, his kingliness. He's defeated these people that took it away. He wants to also unify the people and demonstrate his connection to God and his political strength. The moment he brings it here, we see David, I think, doing the things the three of you just said at the beginning. He gets it there, and I'm sure he feels good about it. You guys know what it's like when you've been pursuing a hard task for a long time and you actually have success. I'm sure that was part of it, but also we're going to see him take a moment to just acknowledge and worship God. He's so thankful for what God means and represents to him. And I think maybe his hopes, God brings a lot of hope to us. And David responds in a physical, outwardly way. So just said, I know, David, you probably know a lot of important details about that. I just did a very quick summary, but anything to add?
No, but it is interesting. You covered it well. It's interesting to see the history of that. And like you said, the presence of the ark brought trouble to some and brought peace to others.
Right.
But it was always to be reverenced and as a symbolic presence of God.
Yeah.
And I think it was interesting that the movability, of the ark was to teach the people that God would be present with them wherever.
Yeah.
And so that may be why David really wanted it in Jerusalem, to show that God was with him and there in that city that became the capital city for his kingdom.
Yep.
It's fascinating to read the whole history of that, because it was away for 20 years before it came back to Israel. And
and it's interesting to me because we have symbolic things, I think, in modern Christianity, right, that symbolize God's presence or maybe our connection to God. But to know that God had actually said, here's the stone tablets, here's my covenant, here's the ark, here's the tabernacle, and I'm just, he instructed them to take it everywhere you go, I go with you. And like you said, they learned through this process. And as a teacher, I think all the time about how can you get into people's minds and help them learn, and not just learn about something, but learn it to the point where it becomes part of their actual processing too. And so that's what he did through this, the story of the ark. It's pretty fascinating.
And as it was told King David, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God. So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. And when those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, he sacrificed an ox and a fattened calf. And David danced before the Lord with all his might, and David was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the horn. As the ark of the Lord came to the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart.
Okay, so I'm trying to envision this. I'm sure it describes a few people, but I guess in my mind, I have this as maybe almost like a parade. I envision David has advertised this. We're going to see in a minute that he feeds everybody there. So I think there's been some PR that's gone out ahead of time, possibly. I don't get the impression that it was snuck into town or in the middle of the night. Yeah, I get the impression that this was a really big event, and I envision kind of maybe celebration happening, or at least some pageantry. Yep. And it's a physical thing. It's not like you can hide it. It was physically brought in. And so David brings it in, and there's a whole bunch of detail here. There it says that there were people carrying the ark. And remember, the ark could not be touched. So I'm sure they had something it was sitting on. They were touching that, and because we know what happened to somebody who touched it. Some other people were unfortunate and oops. So, they're bringing it in. It's a big deal. People know this part of their history. So I'm sure just the legend of it is really quite amazing. People haven't laid eyes on it, like David said, for at least 20 years because it's been captured and held somewhere else. So it's brought here, and it says there were 6 steps taken. After the first 6 steps, the first thing David does is he has a bull sacrificed. And we all know, we don't have time to cover it really, but we all know the concept of sacrificial behavior and all that entails. And then the next verse is where the controversy begins, right? So David is so excited. He's wearing a linen ephod. And what I gathered from that was that he wasn't wearing his king stuff. He didn't go out there, right, dressed in his, I'm the king. He was wearing maybe something that would have been more, I guess, not as elevated in status. And even that, I think about, we talk about how we should dress to go to church. Do we have to wear our best? Kind of a thing. And we kind of see that that's apparently not a contemporary discussion. This was going on back then, right? So he's only wearing his linen ephod. And then he danced. And he didn't just dance, he danced with all his might. What do you guys gather from this little picture? I just have so much fun envisioning this.
The first kind of funny part, if you want to say that, is in verse 13 where he took the 6 steps.
Yeah.
And some of the commentators put a lot of emphasis on that, like he was just trying it out. Because remember the time before when he tried to move it, somebody touched it when it fumbled, kind of moved around, and they were killed. So he said, let's test this out. Let's take a few steps and see. and when nothing happened, he said, okay, let's go ahead then. We'll have a sacrifice and move it on.
Yeah.
We made it.
Quick, sacrifice the bull. We did it. We're here. We got it.
Yeah.
One of the things that I thought was rather interesting is, can you imagine the equivalent of our president being out in the street, taking off his suit and tie and a pair of jeans and a t-shirt and dancing wildly?
Yeah.
That's the modern day equivalent. Or if you were to go to England, it would be the Queen out dancing in the street. Sure. Without her crown or any of the things that go along with being the queen, and just dancing with abandon. And so they would look at them as a kook.
Yeah.
You see the white ambulances coming.
Yes.
The straight jackets.
So,
but yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And because there is that little footnote you just said, dance without abandon. Like I don't think he was really aware of anyone else. I don't know if you guys have ever experienced that, but just a moment of worship where you just forget everything around you. He's so elated. Like David said, he's like, I did it. We got it into town. We just took a few steps. Nothing catastrophic has happened. This is real. This is his dream, and it's coming to fruition. And he takes a second and just breaks out and dance. I don't know if you guys have ever experienced that, or maybe you want to share. I don't know if I've danced publicly, and I don't own an ephod, but
I'm going to sidetrack just for a second and go to video. But it's that same effect at different circumstances. But when you sit down, you start playing, and then you turn around, look away, and 4 hours have gone. Yes. If you're an Advent, and it's the same thing with music too. I mean, if you get to the point where the music, you can get lost in the music.
Right.
And so that, I could very well see David becoming so engrossed in his worship that, the people fall away, everything falls away, and he's just worshiping.
Yeah. And he's the king, like you guys just said, like he is, and he worked hard to get there. He's not a king who was, his dad died at age 6 and he's appointed to the throne. David's journey to becoming the king of the people, has been long and quite publicized, right? I mean, if there was a tabloid magazine back then, he would have been the cover page for years. So, you know, he's celebrating in this moment. I'm sure there's just so much going through his heart and his mind. And he really just kind of is not really worried about appearances. He's really just communing with God for a second and showing his gratitude. And it's interesting because, and it says, while the entire house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sound of trumpets. So this is kind of that corporate worship Lauren was talking about a little while ago. And sometimes when you're seeing someone else in a worshipful state, that can also inspire you, I think, to have that mindset. But apparently, you know, he's also, I guess, feeding off their energy too. What do you guys gather from what's happening here? I like to think about this scene. Wouldn't it be cool to have a time machine and be able to go back and see this?
Yeah, I think it's just very, very exciting. And like you said, like we in worship situations, I feel like we can feed off of each other. In terms of, you know, if somebody's being super worshipful, that might make somebody who's a little bit more shy, a little bit more open, and just gathering all these people together and to share in the excitement that David has. And I think as like Christians, our excitement for the Lord rubs off on others. So when I was reading that part, that's kind of what I thought of, like, how can I be more exuberant in my worship to help other people get on board about Jesus. So
you bring up a good point, because that's kind of one of our closing questions today, or where we're headed. You know, there are many styles of worship. Just think worldwide or nationwide, or just in, you know, Protestant practices, and even just in our county, you could observe everything, you know. There's very liturgical style worship and very sedate, you know, very introspective type of worship, to kind of what we're seeing here, maybe a much more physical, outward, and vocal expression of our worship. The question that we're asked to consider, and because you guys are experts, you know, is one or the other right or wrong? Is one type better or worse? Because we know that in our modern discussions, this comes up sometimes. Or is there just a time or place? What do you guys think about that?
All of the above.
Yeah.
A lot of it depends on our culture, I guess, our upbringing, what we were used to, what we liked, what we learned and grew to like, or whatever. And different occasions call for different types of worship. Sometimes it is much more solemn. Sometimes it is very exuberant and exciting. I don't know that there's a right and wrong way. Well, there may be some wrong ways that are just way out there that would be against all values that anybody has.
Right.
Live sacrifices or something that we don't go with anymore.
Right.
But you know, it depends on the person and the spirit of that individual, I think.
Yep. And maybe clearly the circumstance too, because this same King David that is basically partying with you know, with like, man, he's just out there. But he's the same person we know that in the Psalms has very, very, very introspective personal moments of worship and ways of expressing his heart and gratefulness to God. So I think you just said that well. It is kind of all of the above. I'm certainly not going to put on record here that I think there's a, you know, a way to do it, because we're all different. Lauren, one of you said also like the corporate style of worship. I think that's where it gets more noticed. You know, sometimes we look at a group and we think this is how they do it, or this is how they do it, or, you know, I'm not comfortable. You kind of alluded to that. Sometimes it's just what we're comfortable. But the Holy Spirit also can provoke, I think, these different reactions in us. Well, we're going to see that in the next few, the verse. Did you have something else, David?
I was just going to say, it made me, as we got the lesson, kind of just thumb quickly through the Psalms.
Yeah.
And you see there, you know, places it has sing praises, others says clap your hands, shout to God,
Right.
make music. It says dance, play with the trumpet, the timbrel, all of it. So again, it depends on the person, the spirit of that individual. I don't think we ought to be forced into having to fit a style. I think it comes from the heart and our relationship with God as to what speaks to us and what is who we are,
Right.
how it reflects who we are in our
Yep.
worship. The corporate worship does add another dimension. That's where you get into
Yes.
larger groups, because in a larger group, you've got a lot of different styles. So how do you balance all of that?
Yep. And just peer pressure and sometimes plays a part, or like you said, expectation. I had a friend one time, and this is just kind of interesting, but her boys went to a summer camp and they hated it. They came home and they were very upset. And it's because they had been forced to speak in tongues, that kind of, and it was just, and that's just a tiny example. And I'm not, speaking for or against, I'm just saying it was because they had been brought up in one tradition,
Right.
went somewhere and, had this expectation of another, and they weren't comfortable with it. And without looking at, doctrinal things there, I'm just thinking sometimes it really, the best worship, the expression of worship is the kind that's just coming naturally from us, where we are, what we're used to, and our place, or kind of where we're at in our walk, also with our relationship with God. Well, so David is cool with this, but his wife is not. Right? And if mama ain't happy, nobody's happy. Is that how that goes, or something? So his wife is looking out the window, it says. So that's, to me, was just intriguing as a wife. I thought, if this is my husband's defining moment, why am I in the house watching? I don't know the circumstances, but she's not there down on the street with all the people shouting. I mean, I don't know. I think people probably watched from their windows all the time anyway, but I probably harshly judged her. But she doesn't have the same response as we're having. We're like, go David, you go. I wish I could be that, I forgot what yours says, but mine says she despised him in her heart. Okay. What do you think is happening here? Why does she find his behavior despicable?
Well, she's embarrassed, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, I wondered if did she believe?
Mm-hmm.
Those that don't believe tend to despise.
All right.
And so that was my question. And there's it's not for me to judge by no means, but I was wondering when she saw that, was she not a believer?
Right.
Then you could throw in jealousy as well. But
yep.
Mm-hmm.
She's clearly concerned about appearances, right? Which is kind of a shallow but very human response. I hate to say, she's like, oh my, he's supposed to be the king. He's out there acting like an idiot. He's not wearing his king stuff. This isn't very, respectable behavior for a king. Yeah, and maybe she is a little jealous. She has a complex thing going on her because her dad is the one that David took the place of too, right? So there's history there, I'm sure, that's going through her heart. But in general, her response, do we see that sometimes, today? Do we see this kind of judgment, one group or person looking at the way someone else is worshiping? And yeah, like Brian said, either being jealous or maybe they don't have the same belief structure. Do you guys see this happen sometimes today?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Nope. So again, I'm not finding right and wrongs here, even though I'm sure there are really clear gray lines. Haha. But she's not comfortable with it. And they're kind of, I think when I look at this couple, this illustration, they're opposite ends of the spectrum. David is 100% comfortable in his faith right now, and she's probably 100% uncomfortable in hers, and that's kind of where they're at. So let's just look at what happens next, because this is a little more detail. Brian, will you read 17 through 19?
They brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and offerings of well-being before the Lord. When David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the offerings of well-being, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts, and distributed food among all of the people, the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, to each a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins.
Awesome. So what did they celebrate with? Food, right? Yeah. So what is David doing? So now he's had his own personal worship experience, but then what does he want to do next?
It's all about community. Like he wants everybody to share in this joyous experience. And I love how specific it is.
Yeah.
Like cake of raisins.
Yep.
Very specific.
I'll probably never eat a cake with raisins in it again without thinking about this. Yeah. Yeah. He wants to share it. I think you nailed it. He's so exuberant. He sacrificed burnt offerings and the word fellowship offerings. What's a fellowship offering? I kind of looked this up and saw different commentary about it. What's a fellowship offering, David? What is your take on that?
Sense of community, I guess, and that they're in it together in their worship.
Yep.
Would be my opinion.
Yeah, me too. I read, and that's kind of what I gathered from a lot of read. It was basically this activity. I think of like a community celebration, like old fashioned trading days type theme where everybody's going to come together. But in this case, David's wanting people to all feel this joy that he's experiencing, I think is what is trying to happen. And it says he blessed the people. David then in turn blessed the people in the name of the Lord. He's wanting them to feel as blessed and as grateful and as joyous and experience this worship with him. And he gave them food. And it says the whole crowd of Israelites. And it says both men and women, which means this was a family event, right? David, in a lot of his history, has dealt with just the guys. He's been a military dude. Yeah. And so, but in this case, this is bringing the families together. Everyone is invited to be part of it. And then lastly, we're going to look at verses 20 through 23. David, will you read those?
Yes.
20 through 23. Yep.
When David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would." David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people, Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I'll be humiliated in my own eyes. But by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor." And Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death.
That's so sad.
See a little sarcasm there too.
Definitely sarcastic.
Like, hey, woman.
Hey, the very idea. I mean,
Yes, I know. That was kind of a little sad, maybe, but very human. I think in the family context that we all deal with, sometimes moments of great joy are also tinged with just complication of relationships, family. And probably David's just had literally one of the best moments of his entire life up to that moment, but his wife's just not gonna be happy about it for him. And I'm not condemning her. We know that every person has to work through their own, situation. But I do see that David's like, I'm not going to let you steal my joy. And we use that phrase a lot today. And he even says, look, I'm not going to worry about being humiliated because these other people think this is great. And they were able to find some joy in it too, and he was pretty sarcastic about it. And also footnote, verse 23, I could have done without, but Michal doesn't get to have any babies either. So I'm like, all right, guess we showed her. But it's sad, but it's reality. But one thing we were asked to think about, and I think this is kind of what Michal is actually calling into question. She's saying the question our guide asked us was, what's the boundary between performance and praise? And that happens a lot, even in our own churches. Brian is a musician, Lauren's a musician. We get up there a lot, and I know, David, you have pastored. So what is the difference between you're up there performing and you're actually, trying to encourage this praising, worshipful attitude? And I think that's a tough one, actually. Probably could be a whole nother study. But what do you guys have to say about that?
I think it is a hard line because just coming from like a music standpoint, as a performer, like you want to perform well, because if it's bad, then people might not be able to worship with that because they're like, man, that girl is awful. I can't sing along with this, or I can't, worship to this. So I think it's a really fine line between like being up there and doing a good job and doing that for the glory of the Lord, of course, but not wanting any of the praise necessarily for yourself,
Right.
but just for God. And I think that's why I always feel a little bit more comfortable performing in black. And I know that we do that as musicians anyways, but the point of that is so the music, like I'm not the subject, or the orchestra isn't the subject of attention, it's just the music. So I think getting ourselves into a place where we don't become the distraction, but the music becomes the worship for us and for other people.
Yeah. Yeah. But she was concerned about appearances, right? She's like, he's out there doing that for himself, but David was really in it for God. So even though he was kind of the object of the attention in a way, that wasn't his intention. It wasn't his heart. Mm-hmm. And that can be tough sometimes. Andy always will say, let the words of my mouth be what? He wants it to all be to glorify God. And I think as a pastor, I think oftentimes when I hear someone speak, and David, you probably have dealt with this many times when you're talking, you should speak to it, but you're trying to help people, guide them through God's word without it being all about you. Because let's face it, we all know churches that have collapsed because the pastor leaves. And you think, okay, then where was the emphasis? Was it on that person? And that's, I mean, in a small way, that happens to music directors a lot too. A band program can be flourishing. And if the person leaves, and sometimes it's not successful, and sometimes is it only because everybody really was counting on that one person rather than the art or their skills. And in churches, I have seen this happen too. So I don't know. Do you have anything else to add about that?
Maybe one of the best signs of a good leader is when the leader leaves, things do continue well. Right. But I do think, as Lauren says, it's a two-edged sword. You want to do your best because of the importance of it. And I always felt this, particularly with funerals and weddings and whatever. But just in preaching too, the spotlight, so to speak, is on you. But you say, you don't want it to be on you. You want it to be on the words and what you say. But you want to do it well, so it will not be a distraction. Right. And so it is, I think it's a preparation of your heart so that the emphasis will not be on yourself. Right. But you have to be conscious of that, I think, yep. And keep that in mind.
Yeah. All of us could probably see ourselves in each of these characters we've discussed. Maybe, I think I've definitely felt like David occasionally, and I've definitely probably been Michael. I've also probably been the people of Israel, that crowd we're talking about, just shouting and praising and part of this group. And then the people we've talked about ourselves, feeling like a performer and just being concerned about what my real heartful, worshipful attitude is. And so worship can bring us clarity, though. I think in each of these instances, we're seeing that when we're in an act of worship, it really is that time and space when we are really worshiping and trying to connect with the person we described at the beginning, this God, this creator, this all-powerful being, and most of the time we're busy going about our day. But these times when we actually worship and we're aware of it, even if it's in a mundane thing, like Lauren mentioned nature, Brian said just at work sometimes, it's just those instances where God has enough grace and mercy to allow us in our humanness to stop and reflect and be aware of his presence, and be grateful for it and worship him for the fact that he is this, our creator and our savior. And so worship, I think if we were going to close with the question, how do I go about worshiping God? I think David already said it a little while ago, and Brian, you all alluded to it. It's kind of a fluid, rolling answer. It can depend on circumstance. It can depend on the condition of our heart, the status of where we're at any moment with God, or as we see here in our relationships. Anybody else have anything to add or want to give last minute advice to people joining us today? How do I worship? How do we worship? What do you
I'd
think?
like to say just about a performer,
Yeah,
you know, in guiding practice and performances both. I think for the performers, I've been in with our performances and I've seen people worshiping just in practice.
yeah,
And I think when you get to the point that you know the music and the music becomes not the performance, but it's the worship of performing. We worship through performing.
yep,
And so, even when we sing the same song 15 times, the 15th sometimes is sweeter than the first because you are more comfortable with it. So that's, just the act of performing is our worship. And we want to share that with others and be blessed. And, a lot of times people don't even realize how much we're blessed as the performer by watching them worship themselves.
sure.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, that's a great point. And that is, like you just said, so really the worshiping takes place on both sides of the equation.
Yes.
Too.
Mhm.
People who sharing it or experiencing it, or sometimes we see these Israelites in the crowd, they're just observing it and,
Correct.
and able to be part of the worship. That's great. And it can happen in all circumstances. I mean, through researching this and just reading some stories, people experience worship not not just in the happy, dancing, joyful times. You can experience worship in times that aren't maybe perfect or excellent or celebratory, right? So the fact that the four of us could even come here today is worshipful, I think. And
Yes.
yeah. Yeah, okay. Well, I thank all of you for being here, and I would just like to tell you that it's a pleasure to be able to discuss the Bible with people who are so amazing and out there sharing God's word. And so I thank you for worshiping with me today, everybody that's joining us. And I will say goodbye for now. Anybody got anything to add? Bye. All right. Have a good week and happy Thanksgiving. Blessed Thanksgiving wishes for everybody. Enjoy time with family and friends.